Mr. Ayukawa says he has always been protected by a ghost of a schoolgirl. The first time he noticed this when he was on his way home drunk one winter day. While crossing a pedestrian street, ignoring a red light, Mr. Ayukawa unexpectedly slipped and fell. It was a very cold day, and the road surface was completely covered in ice. Unfortunately, a truck was coming towards him. Since there was still some distance between the truck and him, he thought he could cross the street without any fuss, even if he ignored the traffic light and stepped out. However, the truck hadn't noticed him and kept its speed. He thought blankly that it was going to be over. Oh, so this is death. I've done so many bad things, so I guess I'm going to hell. Mr. Ayukawa was staring dumbfounded at the taillights of the approaching truck, thinking in his mind. But the next moment, a figure suddenly appeared between him and the truck. It was a girl with black hair and wearing a sailor suit uniform. As soon as the girl appeared, the truck, which had been running straight toward him, slid sideways and crashed into a telephone pole with a roaring sound. I was more frightened than being scared of death, he said, because the girl who had saved me was someone I knew. Mr. Ayukawa was later questioned by the police, but was soon released. Although the police were a little pushy because of his background, he was given only a stern warning for jaywalking. After that, Mr. Ayukawa was nearly killed several times. Each time, a girl in her school uniform appeared in front of him, and she made the situation where his imminent death became more distant. When a minor argument at a tavern turned violent, and he was dragged into a back alley and was almost beaten to death by several people, the police, whom he had not called, arrived as soon as the girl appeared and saved the day. When a co-worker at the factory where he worked was unaware of his presence and turned on a machine that could have killed him, it suddenly stopped as soon as she appeared. Mr. Ayukawa survived with only a slight sprain when he fell to the ground with shock. When he almost caused a self-inflicted accident due to drunk driving, he managed to avoid a fatal situation by turning the wheel in a hurry when the girl appeared in front of him. So far, Mr. Ayukawa says that the girl has saved his life 7 times. If it were true, he would be thankful and worship her as a guardian angel of good fortune. But Mr. Ayukawa told me that every time she appears, he would feel a cheer or fear run through his body. I really don't know what she's thinking. She really has no reason to save my life all these times, he says with a sigh. It was about 10 years ago that Mr. Ayukawa returned to society. Until then, he had been in prison for a brutal crime. The charge was sexual assault and murder. The victim was a girl who was a minor at the time. When Mr. Ayukawa was on the verge of death, the girl in the school uniform who appeared and saved him was dressed exactly like the victim he had killed with his own hands. She looked exactly the same when I killed her. Even her expression, he said. Rolled back eyes, tongue hanging out of her mouth, foaming. She saves me every time with that same face. I don't know what she's trying to do. He has wondered many times whether or not to go for an exorcism, but he can't help stepping back when he thinks about what will happen when she's gone. Why on earth does the young girl whose life he had taken so unfairly try to protect him who had brought her to her death? Since Mr. Ayukawa, the person in question, does not have any clue, neither I can even try to guess the reason. It was about 15 years ago. I came across something really nasty. Mr. Kakuta, a CEO with a face like a Yakuza gangster, began his story. He runs a demolition company, and he himself works on the front lines as a foreman. Even though it's called a company, it's like a sole proprietorship, he says. And if I don't do the work myself, the site doesn't get done by itself. Laughing loudly, he downs a medium mug of beer. I met this powerful Mr. Kakuta at a tavern frequented by an acquaintance. We became friends over the course of several visits, and when he learned that I was collecting horror stories, he agreed to tell me what he had. After putting his mug on the table, Kakuta-san folded his arm and began to tell after ordering another round. So, this is his tale. I received a request to demolish a house. The order came from a real estate agent he knew. They had known each other for a long time, and as usual, he asked Kakuta-san to give him an estimate. I told him, "All right, I'll go to the site, so tell me where it is." Based on the information from the real estate agent, Kakuta-san immediately went there. The place was located on the outskirts of a quiet residential area and had barely any traffic. It was a beautiful house, and he thought it was built by a major architect and contractor who spent a lot of money on it. The house they were asked to demolish had a white two-story. Since he had heard that the house was to be demolished, he thought it would be an ancient and beaten-down place, but it appeared to be fairly new. The exterior of the house was splendid, with a Western-style wall surrounding one side, a large gate, and a garden with an unusual and unique yet polished design. There was also a large wooden deck in the yard, indicating that a lot of money must have been spent not only on the house, but also on the exterior. However, the natural lawn was unkept, and it was overgrown with weeds. The house looked as if it would be vacant for several years, but with some simple remodeling, it still looked ready for anyone to move in right away. "I went and looked at the property. Are you going to demolish it? It would be a waste." On the way back, Kakuta-san contacted the real estate agent to give him an estimate of the property. The agent asked back, "Kaku-chan, so how much are you willing to take on the job?" The real estate agent rushed to answer before giving any answer to Kakuta-san's question. He was a little puzzled by his hasty response and proceeded with the conversation. "I'd like at least 3.5 million, considering the size of that lot and the size of the house." Then the agent said, "I know it's a lot to ask, but can you do it for about 2 million? 2 million? That's too much to ask. This fee includes household goods, isn't it? That would be 3 million no matter how cheap." "Then 2.5 million. 2.5 million. Please," he interrupted. Kakuta-san was about to refuse the offer, but the agent seemed desperate than ever, so he assumed there was a reason. Okay, 2.5 million it is. Let's do it. I know you've been giving me a lot of work, so if I don't return the favor once in a while, I'll be punished." He laughed. "I'm really sorry, Kaku-chan. I owe you one." The agent thanked him. "Don't worry about it. But you must have a good reason to bargain, right? I know this is a silly question, but can you tell me the reason you want the house to go so badly, Mr. Fukuda?" "I'm sure you know who Mr. Fukuda is, but just to be clear, he's the owner of the real estate agency. Kakuda-san always said that there is a unique market price for Fukuda's projects. Of course, there's the general market price, but since they have known each other for a long time, they seem to have a sense of the amount of money that Mr. Fukuda should charge this much. That is why Kakuta-san was surprised that Mr. Fukuda negotiated a price with him, which was something he had not done in the past few years. It's like I cheated my way out of this, Kaku-chan, but... Huh? I was gonna explain to you if you accepted the contract, but... Nah, I really should have told you when I asked for an estimate. You know what happened there a few years ago? The one where the whole family was killed? Hey, yeah! I remember now, that one. It was all over the news, wasn't it? That's the house where all the killings happened. That case was a family murder that took place in Kakuta-san's hometown. A tragic incident in the past. A wife and 2 children were murdered while the head of the family was on a business trip. I think it was the case where the family members were all killed by a criminal who broke into the house for the purpose of robbery while the husband was on a business trip, right? Yeah, exactly. The husband was suspected at first because he and his wife were not on good terms or something. That's the one. I remember our employees were also screaming that the husband was the murderer. I told them to stop that kind of thing, and they said it's all over the internet. The internet's just not my thing, so I didn't know about it then, but it turned out it was someone else, right? The culprit was a guy with a criminal record, and he had robbed the place before. Mr. Fukuda was right. He had been repeatedly robbing the victim's house, but he committed the crime because he saw the house and thought the family was loaded. On the day of the incident, the criminal who broke in detained the wife and children. However, when the husband was nowhere to be seen, the perpetrator, thinking he had escaped, went into a frenzy and killed the wife and children. The husband, who could not contact his family the next day, left his business trip early, saw the crime scene, and reported it to the police immediately. A few months later, the murderer was arrested in another case and confessed to the incident. I won't go into details, but although the murderer denied any intention of killing, because of the suddenness of the crime, he was sentenced to death because of his premeditation and the maliciousness of the crime. So, the client, is the husband that survived. In fact, several years before the incident, I had searched for land to build the house in question. Fukuda said that he not only searched for the land, but also advised the client on mortgage matters, and perhaps that was why he was asked to dispose of the property. His name is Tamiya-san. You asked me earlier if I thought I could still sell the house, right? I told him the same thing, but he said he couldn't stand the idea of someone else living in the house of his memories. I understood him, so we decided to clear the land and sell it as he wanted. It's a good location, isn't it? If we were to sell it, we could sell it right away after it's just barren land. I see. That's why. Mr. Tamiya came to Fukuda's office once, but didn't seem to have any money. Fukuda told him that it would cost around 3 to 4 million yen to dismantle the building. He told Fukuda that the most he could manage to come up with was 2.5 million. I'm sorry, Kaku-chan, I'm acting like a crybaby, Fukuda says. Hearing this, Kakuta-san agreed. He felt that he had come to his senses and, conversely, felt that he had to help people. So he decided to take on the project at the originally proposed price of 2 million yen. Kakuta-san said, Well, to be honest, I can't make any profit. My job is just to destroy things, but if it helps people, I'll be more than willing to take it." 1 week later, he met up with Mr. Fukuda and Mr. Tamiya at the site. There were various matters to be confirmed and documents to sign before the demolition. Even though they were going to demolish the building, they didn't want to just go out and tear it down with construction equipment. They had to confirm the building and land in advance, measure the width of the road facing the site, and the distance from the neighboring house, and so on. In this case, Mr. Tamiya wanted all the household furniture and goods to be disposed of, so they told him that they would dismantle everything. They also confirmed whether or not to have demolition purification for the tragic incident, but Mr. Tamiya declined. "The truth is, I wanted them to hold a Shinto ceremony of purifying a building site because of what happened," Mr. Fukuda said. "But we couldn't force Mr. Tamiya to do it, so we decided to proceed as is." The police conducted an on-site inspection of the interior of the house and found that it had been left as it was at the time of the incident, only it had been cleaned up. After the police had finished their job, Mr. Tamiya had cleaned up the house by himself. "To be honest, I don't even want to go in the house." Mr. Tamiya turned his back to Kakuda-san and the others in the living room, muttered something that left a strange impression on him. So the contract was signed and the schedule was adjusted. 1 month after the meeting, the decision was finally made to dismantle the building. One might have the impression that heavy machinery would suddenly be used for demolition, but this was not the case. I did not notice, but the first step was to remove equipment and interior materials by hand. I was told that home appliances and household goods must also be removed at this point, and that the demolition work must be done separately due to various legal restrictions. When the demolition finally began, Mr. Tamiya watched the work from the beginning to the end of the first day. Kakta-san also told him that it was dangerous for him to be there when tearing the building down, but he changed where he stood each time and watched the work. Kakta-san said, "In our talks, he told me that he and his wife were not getting along, but that was only a short time before the incident, and they were basically doing fine. Mr. Tamiya said that the children were good and honest. He said he had built the house with the hope that the family would be happy. It was really heartbreaking to think about that, knowing what happens after." When it was finally time for the heavy machinery to go to work, Kakta-san found Mr. Tamiya watching the work as usual and told him that they were going to start demolishing the house. "It's time, huh?" Mr. Tamiya looked sadly at the house filled with memories. Not finding any words to say, Kakta-san bowed and returned to his work. A backhoe with a young employee on board was about to start tearing down the house. The arm of the backhoe was raised and the bucket began to smash the second floor. "I've handled a lot of demolition projects," Kakta-san said, "but this is the first time I had that kind of heart-wrenching feeling." It was when about half of the house had been dismantled that he was observing the work with an uneasy feeling. A scream sounded from behind him. He turned and saw Mr. Tamiya running toward the house with great speed. "Tamiya-san, no! It's dangerous!" Mr. Tamiya disappeared into the house, probably not hearing Kakta-san's warnings. Despite Mr. Tamiya's entry into the house, the backhoe demolition work showed no sign of stopping. "Hey! Stop it! Stop it!" Kakta-san shouted to his employees to stop the backhoe. The employees did not stop working, perhaps not hearing him over the noise of the destruction. "Stop it, you idiot! We've got a man in there! I told you to stop!" After yelling at him as hard as he could, the employee finally realized that Kakta-san was shouting. "Boss, what's wrong?" "It's not about what's wrong. A person went inside the house, didn't you see?" "What? Seriously? I really didn't notice." "Don't give me that. Turn off the engine and get out, now!" He yelled at the employee who was conducting, gathered all the employees around him, and approached the house. The house was literally half destroyed, and he had to pray that Mr. Tamiya was not caught in the middle of it. "Tamiya-san! Hey! Mr. Tamiya! Are you safe? If you're okay, answer me!" Kakta-san called out loudly, but there was no response. He called out repeatedly, and then another employee approached him. "Boss, is something wrong all of a sudden? You know the guy here ran into the house screaming just now, didn't ya?" "What? No, I didn't see him." Starting with that employee's comment, everyone voiced their confusion. Everyone said they didn't see anything. "How can there be so many of you and no one has seen him? There was someone watching from the side entrance the moment we started working today, wasn't there? That's him." "Who are you talking about, sir?" "Not just today, but the person who's been watching us since we started dismantling this house." "Boss, don't be afraid. There's no such person." All the employees there assured him that they had not seen Mr. Tamiya. Kakta-san got chills all over his body at that moment. He asked the crew, "Didn't you see me talk to him once in a while?" And they said they just thought he wandered off the premises often. That's how it was with everyone. Kakta-san was puzzled by the situation, but he called the police and emergency services just in case. He reported the possibility that the residents might have been involved in the demolition of the house. The police, EMS, and the fire department arrived immediately. Kakta-san gave a detailed account of what had happened at the scene. The police and firefighters approached the half-destroyed house to check on the situation. "About 30 minutes after their arrival," he said, "I was called by an older police officer. He asked about the person who had entered the house, and I told him it was Mr. Tamiya who was the owner. The officer looked at me in a funny way. I thought it was strange that he gave me a look like that. Then he started explaining something that was hard for me to believe. 'I don't mean to be suspicious of you,' he said, 'but Mr. Tamiya, the landlord of this house, committed suicide about 3 weeks ago.' They thought that I had the wrong guy, but I couldn't think straight when I heard that. The police told me that he was gone, but didn't give me any details. I later learned that Mr. Tamiya had hanged himself in a nearby wooded area. Mr. Fukuda did not know about this either, and we learned that he had died soon after signing the contract. Mr. Fukuda also came to the demolition site. He had a short conversation with Mr. Tamiya at that time. Me and Mr. Fukuda were the only ones who saw Mr. Tamiya. We were having a perfectly normal conversation. I still can't believe that it was a ghost." After hearing that much, I felt ashamed but asked Kakta-san what happened to the demolition fee. He thanked Mr. Tamiya, saying that the money had been transferred immediately after the contract was signed. "I've been involved in many demolition sites, but I've never had such a bad aftertaste. Of course, there were things that happened because of the circumstances. Above all, I'll never forget the look on Mr. Tamiya's face when he went over to the site together. I could tell that he was still thinking about his family. I remember he said something like, "If only I hadn't gone on that business trip that day," or some such regretful remarks. I guess the person who said he didn't even want to enter the house decided at the last second he wanted to end up with the house of his memories. Also, Mr. Fukuda told me that Mr. Tamiya had been paying the mortgage on the house even after the death of his family. I don't know how he managed to pay for it, but I guess he thought he could at least keep the house. But eventually he couldn't make ends meet, and he was in a lot of debt when he died. He was in a deadlock, and I think he finally reached a point where he couldn't handle it anymore. I was struck by the lonely and forlorn look on Kakuta-san's face as he finished his story. Afterwards, when the land was cleared, 4 houses were built for sale by a major house builder. They were sold out in no time because they were located on the outskirts of a popular area and the prices were a little low. The locals who knew what had happened shunned away from that area, but it seemed to be attractive to those who didn't know. All 4 buildings were occupied soon after completion, but within a year, 2 of them were put on the market. A buyer soon followed, but he, too, moved out within a year. Of the 4 buildings originally purchased, only 1 continues to be occupied, but 3 of the 4 buildings are currently vacant. Mr. Fukuda said that there might be something wrong with the land itself and not with Mr. Tamiya. Most of us in the demolition business are surprisingly concerned about things like land purification ceremonies, Kakuta-san says. It's true there are a lot of people in the demolition business who underestimate such things, and in fact they have suffered a lot of pain. Fortunately, in this case, there was no such accident. Well, if you like scary stories, you'd better remember them. Kakuta-san finished his tale and took a giant gulp of beer. Mr. Inazawa spent his childhood in a regional city in Hokkaido and left his hometown for higher education upon graduation. He went on to a university in Sapporo and later worked for a medical company there. His ties to his hometown were almost completely severed except for 2 visits a year, the Bon Festival during summer and New Year's. When he turned 40, Mr. Inazawa was no longer living with his wife. Although he did not have a wife and children, he was leading a fulfilling life balancing his hobbies and work. Sometimes he would feel loneliness because he was single, but he enjoyed the freedom and his growing savings. In his middle age, he was beginning to get fat as a working member of society, and he would indulge himself in his hobby of fishing when he needed to relax his mind. It was unexpected and sudden that he received the news of his mother's death. She was already over 70, he said, but she had no chronic illnesses and was always in good health when we saw her, so my brothers and I had let her guard down. His mother had slipped and fell from an icy pedestrian bridge in winter, hit her head on the pavement, and died. Mr. Inazawa returned to his hometown for the funeral, where he and his brothers discussed what to do with the family home. Unfortunately, his father had passed away from a serious illness when his sons were around 20 years old, so there would be no one left to live there. However, he could not quit his current job to inherit the house, and all of his brothers except Mr. Inazawa had wives and children. In the end, everyone decided that it was impossible for them to move, so they decided to sell the whole house. He informed his workplace of the situation and took an extended leave of absence while he worked on cleaning up his parents' house. As Mr. Inazawa was sorting through his old room that had now turned into a storage space, he came across an old school yearbook. It was an elementary school graduation book. It is common for people to find nostalgic items while cleaning, but this kind of distraction is the most time-consuming of all, since most people cannot resist the urge to go through it. Mr. Inazawa was no exception, so he stopped to flip through the yearbook and began to immerse in his childhood. There were those he had never seen since graduation, and others he has somehow continued to still have contact with. The ones he disliked at the time, the ones he made fun of behind their backs, the teachers who were funny and popular. As he gazed at the page of his classmates' names and photos, Mr. Inazawa suddenly noticed something. Eriko was not there. She was a cheerful girl, always smiling and laughing. She had big round eyes and was friendly to everyone. Naturally, being popular with the boys, some even had serious crushes on her. When it came to sharing secrets, her name would pop up every time since somebody was always in love with her. Of course, Mr. Inazawa was one of them. He remembered the itchy yet bittersweet feeling he had for Eriko, who was cheerful all the time. She was definitely the first love of his life. However, neither the name nor the face of Eriko, who holds such fond memories for him, was not in the photo book. He wondered if the faculty had forgotten to include her name in the book by mistake, but her name was also missing from the section where students wrote messages to the class and essays about their ambitions for the future. Mr. Inazawa wondered what was going on, and as he tried to remember, he came up with a possibility. At the time, he didn't have any doubts at all, but now that he thought about it again, his memories of Eriko were a little strange. First of all, he didn't remember seeing Eriko outside the classroom. That was not the only strange thing about the memory. The first thing to remember was that Eriko always got up from her seat and spoke to him first with her usual smile, regardless of whether the class was in session or not. He would respond to her as if it was lunch break, and he didn't remember his homeroom teacher getting mad at him for it. I was starting to wonder if she was a manifestation of my imagination. An imaginary friend, or so I thought at first, he recalls. But if that's the case, there's something strange. Mr. Inazawa does indeed remember talking about Eriko with other classmates. It was the same when him and his friends were talking and gossip, who likes who, and he also remembered that Eriko came to him when he was playing with some of his friends. Although it was possible that his brain had changed his memory in a way that was convenient for his young fantasies, but he was still somewhat curious and decided to contact one of his friends. Him and Mr. Yada go way back since elementary school, and this boy had a proper face and name in the graduation photo in front of him. It was easy to get in touch with him, as they still go out for drinks together when Mr. Inazawa go back home. When Mr. Yada answered the phone and Mr. Inazawa asked him a question, he laughed and said, "I remember Eriko, of course. You and I both had a huge crush on her, didn't we? I think it's..." As Mr. Inazawa thought, it was not just his imagination. He immediately started to confront Mr. Yada about the absence of Eriko in his graduation photo book and the unnaturalness of his memories of her. But Mr. Yada was having none of it, saying things like, "You're thinking too much," and "Are you trying to be a horror writer or something?" He would not take him seriously at all. Mr. Inazawa reminded him to look at the photo book later and hung up the phone. But a few hours later, Mr. Yada called him again and said, "I looked at the photo book, But she's really not there. From there, the two of them discussed the possibilities. Maybe Eriko had simply transferred to a different school without waiting for graduation. Or Eriko had died of an illness or accident, which shocked them so much that they had erased it from their memory. The simplest answer might be that she belonged in another class, hence not having her photo on their class page. But somehow, none of them felt correct. It's hard to believe that they would forget such a big event as their first love transferring to another school, and although there was a boy who died in their class, there was a section in the photo book memorializing him. Even if Eriko had died while in school, it's strange that only one person is forgotten or taken out. It would be hard to mistake a child in a different grade for a classmate, and above all, none of these possibilities could dispel the irrationality revolving around the memory of a girl named Eriko. The theory that it might have been a kind of mass hysteria seemed the most reasonable, but it also left something unexplained. Could it be one of those Mandela effects? Mr. Inazawa thought. Was it like the yokai Zashiki Warashi, that girl? Mr. Yada said. In the end, after a long phone call, it was decided that this possibility, which Mr. Yada suddenly divulged, was probably correct. It was an unscientific conclusion, but Mr. Inazawa didn't feel bad about it. It would be a gentle way of dropping the matter. It would have been peaceful if this issue had ended there. However, Mr. Yada seemed to be so excited by the unexpected mystery that he called Mr. Inazawa the next day and said, I called some of the people who were still in the area, and some of them remembered Eriko. Let's gather up and have a drink somewhere. You're still not going back to the city, are ya? Having come to the conclusion that Eriko was like a yokai would maybe be laughed at by everyone, but Mr. Inazawa had no particular reason to refuse, and the idea of being reunited with classmates he hadn't seen in decades seemed appealing in its own way. After he responded that he would join the party, Mr. Yada made the arrangements for the date, and about 5 people, including the 2 of them, went to a private izakaya for a drinking party. At first, everyone seemed a little distant, but they were the kind of people who would have jumped at such a sudden invitation. The tension soon ebbed, and they began to have friendly conversations, which did not feel as if several decades had passed without seeing each other. They were frankly having a great time talking about their own personal stories, such as where they are working right now or how they won the lottery and bought a condo. However, when Mr. Yada brought up the subject of Eriko, one of them blatantly lost all expression. I remember Eriko too, he said. I remember her, but it's strange. I had forgotten about her until Yada called me and told me. I probably haven't thought about her since I graduated. I've never recalled her since, but when I heard her name from Yada, all the things I'd forgotten about suddenly started pouring into me. The atmosphere in the room became a little heavy as he sipped his sake after his comment. Mr. Inazawa thought he could relate to him. It's true he had also forgotten about Eriko until he opened the yearbook that day. It's strange, isn't it? It seems like you could have talked about your first love at some point in your life until then, he said. But Eriko was cute, wasn't she? When Mr. Yada said that, perhaps trying to change the atmosphere, the group somewhat relaxed. The guy who had expressed his fears about Eriko also found himself saying, She's cute, but she was also nice. Her friendliness made everyone fall in love with her. The momentary mood of uneasiness turned into a gentle conversation about memories of the mysterious friend from childhood, as the drinks went down and everyone got drunk. "Hey, why don't each of us try drawing a picture of that girl?" Mr. Yada suggested, pulling out notepaper and ballpoint pens for everyone from his bag. Of course, we weren't trying to draw a portrait or anything, but just for fun at the bar. If everyone agreed that Eriko was there, then it would mean that she really existed, and if not, then it would be a mystery that would give us more topics for conversation. Everyone got a piece of paper and a pen and began doodling. After everyone had completed their drawings, they put them out on the table. "Well, I guess you're there after all, Eriko." We all drew the same picture. A cute and thin one-piece outfit and her long waist-length hair, her frail and petite build, a cute mouth that was always smiled wryly, and her face. Her face was covered in big, round eyes all over. Needless to say, everyone froze. All of them didn't think anything strange when they were drawing her. Even though their memories were so vivid that they could draw it as soon as they were told to do so, the moment they saw the image drawn by someone else's hand, the magic was suddenly gone. It was magic, Mr. Inazawa said. Eriko had cast a spell on us, and we broke that magic that night. The party soon came to an end. Mr. Inazawa says he's had no contact with Mr. Yada or any of his former classmates since then. And I think it's the same for all of them, he said with a fatigued look on his face. I just can't get her face out of my head. No matter what he was doing, even at work, when he's not thinking about anything, her face comes back into his mind. He says he can't forget Eriko's face with a friendly smile on her mouth and countless eyes like pimples blinking independently. What am I going to do now? He says. Mr. Inazawa is currently in the care of a relative, having quit his long-time job due to a physical breakdown caused by the strain of his work. The elementary school he attended and spent time with Eriko is still in the same location. When I was in elementary school, there was a narrow 4-story building called the Momo Building behind the neighborhood shopping street. At the time, I didn't know what the building was, but later I learned that it was a love hotel. The building was no longer in business, and all that remained was a battered ruin with an impressive sign with a pink peach logo. I think I was in the 4th grade or so. One of my classmates, Kento, suddenly said to me, "Did you know that you can enter Peachville from the side?" The entrance to the abandoned Peachville was naturally sealed off, but according to his story, there was an unlocked door from the front to the right. He said, "My brother's friend went there to try out his guts, and he found pictures of naked women there." When a child hears such a story, he's tempted to go in. So me, Kento, and Minoru decided to go there. Peachville was located off the main shopping street, so it wasn't so visible to the public. However, in the evening, the nearby izakayas and bars start to open for business, so the streets became a little more crowded. We decided to go there in the daytime during summer vacation because it was better to go in the early afternoon when there are fewer people than in the evening. On that day, we arrived at Peachville, taking the long way around to avoid being seen. Come here, Kento beckoned us in a whisper. We sneaked into the right side of the building. Sure enough, there was a door there. He slowly turned the doorknob and pulled, and the door opened with an unpleasant creaking sound. It really opened! Minoru exclaimed. We double-checked that no one was watching us, and then we walked in. Oh my God, it's dark! I turned on the flashlight in a panic. What came into view was a desk left behind and an empty file. Perhaps this room had been used as an office. I looked at the shelves, but nothing that looked like documents remained. Where were all the pictures of naked women? The three of us grumbled and decided to go to the next room. When we opened the door, we found ourselves in a narrow corridor with a spiral staircase in the back. It was here that we learned for the first time that Peachville had a basement. Hey, can I go downstairs? Curious Minoru said, and started to go down the stairs on his own. Kento and I had no choice but to follow him. However, the basement floor was flooded and we couldn't go all the way down, so we hurried back up. The water was disgusting. For some reason, Kento became silent around this point. When we returned to the first floor, we noticed that there was another room next to the office. This room, with a table, ashtray, and sofa, was probably a waiting room for customers. On the wall, there was a large sign that read, "Attention." Overall, the room was still undamaged and seemed to be the only one that could still be used. Oh hey, Minoru said. Isn't this it? Isn't this it? He shined a flashlight on something. There were pictures of women in their underwear or just naked with towels wrapped around them. These must be the photos that Kento's brother's friend had seen. Man, they're not completely naked? Minoru complained and left the room. Kento followed him silently. Okay, now let's go upstairs, Minoru said and started to climb the spiral staircase leading to the second floor. Kento hesitated for a moment, but when I started to follow Minoru, he followed cautiously. The second floor consisted of a hallway and several rooms, all with doors of the same shape. Minoru twisted the doorknobs one by one, starting with the door at the front, but of course it would not open. But when we turned the doorknob of the room at the end of the corridor, he heard a click and it opened with a creak. It opened! Seriously? Wow, that's great! Let's go inside! Me and Minoru shined our flashlights into the room. But then, we froze at the spot. There was a small bathtub and what looked like a bed in the small room. But we noticed right away there was somebody in the bathtub. I could not see her face because of her long messy hair, but I guessed that was a woman. The woman said in a high-pitched voice, I'm sorry, I'm not done with it yet. The next second we dashed down the stairs, returned to the office, and rushed out through the door leading outside. All three of us ran, in silence, away from Peachville. I fell and scraped my knee a few times on the way, but I wanted to get away from the cursed place as quickly as possible, so I didn't care and kept running. What was that? When we reached the park with people, Minoru finally opened his mouth. That was not a living person, was it? A ghost? I replied, and Minoru shook his head sideways. No, there's no such thing as a ghost, he shouted, half crying. Kento, who had been silently watching the situation, muttered, sorry. According to his story, he saw a person standing in the back of the flooded basement. It was a woman with a ragged bath towel wrapped around her scrawny body who looked at us and grinned widely. I didn't say anything because I thought I might have seen it wrong, but I should have told you guys first. Sorry. Kento apologized, and Minoru and I looked at each other. I'm sure I was scared, but it wasn't Kento's fault. Don't worry about it. I consoled him and we went our ways home after that. A few days later, Minoru went missing. Me and Kento got scared and told all the adults what had happened in Peachville. Naturally, we were scolded to death by our parents, teachers, and the police. However, as a result, a search was conducted in and around Peachville, and eventually, Minoru was found and safely protected. I only heard that he was in Peachville and did not know the details of the situation, but when he woke up after sleeping for a while, he seemed to have forgotten that he had gone to the abandoned place with us and that he had entered the building by himself. Later, a friend of Kento's brother, who said he had been in Peachville, told me a shocking story. He told me that the stairs of Peachville were supposed to be walled off and sealed, with no way to get down to the basement or up to the second floor. So, how did we get to the basement and to the second floor at that time? Where was Minoru when he went missing there? The building is now demolished and gone. This was an experience in Nagoya, where I lived when I was in the early grades of elementary school. It was a day in September, still hot and rain was pouring like crazy. On that day, I was on my way home from school with a group of 3 people, including myself and 2 friends of the same grade who lived in the neighborhood. I remember the sky was sticky gray and very dim. When heavy rain fell or strong winds blew due to typhoons, my young heart was thrilled with a sense of the extraordinary. We cackled and joked with each other as we made our way back. I lived where the rice fields were, even though it was in Nagoya, but there were many hills, and the route from home to the elementary school was a slight uphill. It was pouring cats and dogs, and because the area was full with hills, the gutters and drains that ran along the side of the road were filled with water flowing at a tremendous rate. However, the gutters were covered with covers, so whenever we found a place where there was a metal mesh, my friends and I would try to stick a branch into it or pour fallen leaves and play with them. As we were enjoying our little adventure, we found a place where the lid of the gutter had come off and we could see the inside. The amount and force of the water in the ditch was beyond our expectations. We were so excited, we immediately began throwing stones into it and enjoyed watching them being swept away so quickly. It was not every day we saw things like this happen, so we were mesmerized by nature's power and kept throwing things in. Then, someone said, "Hey, let's put umbrellas in the water." We were beginning to get tired of throwing stones and fallen leaves, so we immediately agreed to the suggestion. One of my friends who was wearing a big raincoat said, "I'll do it," and closed his umbrella and plunged it into the ditch. The umbrella was swept away in a second by the powerful current, and water got inside the folded umbrella, breaking it instantly. The cracking sound of umbrella bones breaking could be heard coming from the ditch. At that moment, we heard a voice saying, "Hey, you guys! You guys!" I turned around and saw the vice principal running towards us, all wet and drenched. The vice principal, who rushed to the scene, had a very frightened look on his face and said, "It's dangerous. Go home quickly. You shouldn't play here. It's dangerous, I say." He was a person whom we did not usually have much contact with, but being scolded in such a serious tone Each of us fled the scene. When I returned home, I excitedly told my mother about what had happened. Her expression suddenly turned sullen, and she asked me, "Where exactly was the open ditch?" I answered, "At the bottom of the hill, where the lid was busted open." My mother's face instantly turned into a grimace and said, "Oh my God, that place," and began to tell a story. About 8 years ago, on a similar day of heavy rain, an elementary school boy was returning home. He went missing the very same day, leaving only his school bag on the side of the ditch. The school was notified, and teachers and guardians searched for him, but could not find anything. A few hours later, the boy was found in a ditch several hundred feet away from where he was believed to have fallen, where his school bag was left on the road. The boy's body had been sucked away by the tremendous force of the water, and he was found with every bone in his body broken. It was the vice principal who had yelled at us who found the body, which was stiffened in a snarled shape with its limbs folded into directions it shouldn't be. It was a famous accident among those who lived in the area at the time, and everyone remembers it well. Since the accident, the vice principal began to patrol the students' route on rainy days. Later, the vice principal called me and told me that he was worried about whether anyone had been hurt or not. He mentioned to my mother that when he was out on his round as usual, he saw us gathered in a ditch at the bottom of the hill, so he instantly got frightened and ran to the spot. He also said, "I was so worried because that was the exact spot where the boy had fallen." Since the accident, the ditch on the way to school had been covered with a lid, so he said he was really wondering why the lid was open only that spot on that day. If the vice principal had not come there and warned us, I feel that my friend would have been dragged into the ditch like that boy. Later, when I was talking with my friends who had gone home together, we were saying how glad and grateful we were that the vice principal had come. But when we talked about who had suggested that we put the umbrella in, we found out none of us had said so. Exactly who made such a suggestion that day? Whenever it rains heavily, I still remember the scene of that day vividly, the loud voice and the expression of the vice principal, and whoever's voice saying, "Let's put our umbrellas in." This is a story Mr. Takeda, a typical businessman, experienced. At Mr. Takeda's company, it was customary to have a drinking party every weekend at the president's expense at an izakaya. This was way back in the days when the term, quote, alcohol harassment had not yet been coined. Some might call it the golden era. Although Mr. Takeda was not a strong drinker by any means, he still felt obliged to stay until the second or third izakaya every week, socializing with his co-workers. Of course, he kept the pace down so as not to spoil the mood, but even so, he would inevitably get drunk if he had to stay until the third izakaya. In the end, Mr. Takeda had to return home that day in a staggered state of drunkenness. When he looked at his watch, it was already past 2 a.m. Mr. Takeda's wife was the type who would stay up and wait for her husband no matter how late he got home. Even his drunken, fluffy head had enough conscience to feel guilt for that, so Mr. Takeda hurried home despite his dazed gait. How long had he walked? When he looked down the street, he saw a light at the entrance. "Hey, honey!" His wife came out in front of the house and waved at him. It had been more than 20 years since they had become husband and wife, but Mr. Takeda could not help but smile at the sight of his healthy wife welcoming him with a smile, even at this late hour. "Sorry I'm late. The atmosphere of the party and my boss made it hard for me to leave," he mumbled. Mr. Takeda entered their home with his wife lending him a shoulder as he apologized with a slurred speech. As soon as they got inside, he went to his bedroom with his wife by his side. Opening the sliding door, he found a futon laid out in the Japanese-style room with a navy-hued nightgown folded beside it. It was truly a perfect setting, its hospitality almost like a five-star hotel. Mrs. Takeda closes the sliding door, leaving him to change. Behind her, Mr. Takeda's son smiled and waved them good night. His only son, who will be a high school student this year, is his pride and joy. Thinking that he has grown up to be a good boy who loves his parents, Mr. Takeda tried to change into the nightgown that had been prepared for him. But apparently he was too wasted to bother. Perhaps he was more intoxicated than he thought, or maybe the arrival at his house had loosened him up, so he jumped straight into his futon without changing. Mr. Takeda fell asleep, but his sleep was suddenly interrupted by a disturbing electronic noise. The cell phone in his suit emitted a notification sound, indicating that they had received a text message. Irritated by the interruption to his efforts to sleep comfortably, Mr. Takeda fumbled with his cell phone with a sleepy look on his face and looked at the message he had just received. The sender of the message was his wife, saying, "Can't you come home yet? What's happening?" It is not surprising that Mr. Takeda looked as if he got pranked when he saw it. It was she herself, of all people, who went out of her way to meet him in front of his house. She must be sleepwalking. I'm the one to blame for making her wait until it is late. Smiling at his wife's silly behavior, Mr. Takeda turned over on his right side. What came into view was a familiar scene of a Japanese room with tatami flooring. There was nothing in the room but a futon, and it was quite spacious. He thought, "This is the familiar room where I always sleep." After thinking about it, Mr. Takeda suddenly became aware. "Hey, I don't have a Japanese-style room in my house, do I?" When Mr. Takeda bought his own home, he wanted a Japanese-style room. However, his wife stubbornly said no. She told him that insects had once crawled out of the tatami mats in her parents' house and that she had come to dislike tatami mats because of that. That's why they didn't have a Japanese-style room in their house. But he was definitely sleeping in one now. What does this mean? No, in the first place, he should have always slept in the bedroom shared by the couple. So why am I sleeping in such a room? At first, he just wondered. However, it did not take long for his doubts to turn into fears. Not only this Japanese-style room, Mr. Takeda noticed something else strange. There are no children in his family. His wife has been trying to get fertility treatment for years, but it has not borne any fruit yet. So who was that boy who smiled at him and waved good night to him just a few minutes ago? Why did he think of him as his proud only son who will be a high school student this year? He felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was wrong. Something very strange was happening here. Now completely sobered up, Mr. Takeda opened the sliding door and jumped out, forgetting to pick up the bag he had carelessly thrown down on the tatami mats. The nightgown, still attached to the corner of the futon, caught his eye for a moment, but on second thought, he noticed he didn't have anything like that in his house. He thought to himself, It'll be bad if I stayed in this house. Definitely a bad idea. Fortunately, the light in the living room was off, and the family is... no, the inhabitants seemed to be sleeping. As soon as he arrived at the front door, he tried to put on his shoes, but it took him a long time and he could not get them on properly. Then, Mr. Takeda heard rough footsteps coming up behind him. He didn't care about his shoes anymore. This was no time to be worrying. With an out-of-tune scream, he ran outside and closed the door. At that moment, Mr. Takeda saw what was coming toward him for a moment. He saw an old woman approaching him with an expressionless face like a mask. What Mr. Takeda thought his beloved wife was an old woman with deep wrinkles, big strains around her eyes, and gray and messy hair. Fortunately, Mr. Takeda was able to return home safely. However, he dropped his bag and came home without shoes, so he was scolded by his wife a little for that. Later in the daytime, he visited the place where the house was and found that it was not a house at all, but an ordinary apartment complex. He checked the area and found that there had been no accident, suicide, or anything like that before the apartment was built. His wife laughed at the story, saying that it was the product of a bad drunken dream, but Mr. Takeda could not believe it. Whenever he tells this story to someone, there was something that always came to his mind. The navy-hued nightgown that was folded neatly and placed next to the futon in the Japanese-style room at that time. Whenever he told this tale, he thought of that simple, plain nightgown. I probably wouldn't have been able to come home if I had been wearing that, he said. Mr. Takeda is still living near the apartment where the house appeared. When my grandpa was still a kid, there was an old man who often came to the park near the school to do storytelling using a paper slide. This storytelling man sold candy and sweets and showed picture story shows to the children who bought them. Even now, you rarely see them, and when you do find one, it's almost always as a volunteer. But in the old days, however, it was a proper business, and in the rural area where my grandfather lived, there was not much entertainment, so many different storytellers came to a public park one after another. It was one of those times when a new storyteller came to the area. He had a very big fake nose. Because of his feature, he was called Uncle Big Nose among elementary school children. He soon became very popular. The candy he was selling was only 1 yen, which was a bargain at the time because they would cost around 5 yen if you bought them at grocery stores. Also, the story was different from the popular picture story shows of the time. One of my grandpa's favorites was Tiger Mask, which he had never seen before. He couldn't get enough of the story and was very excited and thrilled. On the first day of Uncle Big Nose's visit, Grandpa was lucky enough to be playing in the park with his friends Takeshi and Minoru. There were a few other kids who were watching the storytelling show. They all liked Uncle Big Nose at once. He said to the kids, "I'll be here every day at 3 p.m. for 2 weeks, so come every day and I'll give a toy to the kids who become regulars." So the old man would come to the park every day. The storytelling done by him was so funny that the kids looked forward to going there every day after school. It must have been about a week after the uncle's first visit. That day, as usual, when Grandpa ran to the school shoebox to go home from school, he saw a girl standing there. "Huh?" He looked closer and saw that it was Mio, my grandpa's first love. "What's wrong?" Grandpa asked her. "Saki and Yuri don't want to go home with me anymore." Nearly crying. Mio-chan was a girl who had moved from Tokyo about 6 months before. She was a girl with a city smell and a very cute face, but was a bit timid. She was often teased for her vivid colored clothing and was being bullied from time to time. Despite all that, Grandpa took an instant liking to her. "Then follow me. There's a picture story show coming to the park in the backwoods. Let's go see it together." These words came out of his mouth without him thinking. "Really? Are you sure?" Mio-chan asked him, so Grandpa decided to go to the park with her to show her a picture story show. It was still hot at 3 p.m. on an early summer day, but there were more than 10 children gathered at the park, including Takeshi and Minoru, two of Grandpa's friends. When Takeshi and Minoru looked at Grandpa, they looked surprised for a moment, as if they hadn't noticed Mio-chan for the first time. Then they looked away awkwardly and started whispering to each other. In the meantime, a picture story show by Uncle Big Nose started. The park, which had been a buzzing place just a moment before, instantly became quiet. The only sound in the park was the chirping of the clappers. Everyone was absorbed in Uncle Big Nose's show, and Mio-chan was no exception. She was so immersed in the storytelling that she didn't even notice the sweat dripping down her forehead. "I've never seen such a fun picture story show," Mio-chan said excitedly. "Right? We've been watching from the beginning," Grandpa said proudly. Takeshi and Minoru, who had been whispering in the distance, had joined the conversation. The four of them were having a good time talking about their thoughts of the picture story show. Whenever the storytelling show was over, Uncle Big Nose would give us origami or some kind of free gift, and on that day there were a few kids gathered around. My grandpa suddenly heard Uncle Big Nose boom, "Don't touch my nose!" and shoved away a kid who fell to the ground. The child fell on his buttocks from the impact of the shove and scowled. Everyone there was also stunned. Next second, as if nothing happened, Uncle Big Nose's smile returned. He said, "Tomorrow I'll give a toy to one of the children who comes to the show. I'll choose one of the children who came today." At first, everyone was surprised, but then he ran to the child who was falling on his buttocks and asked if he was all right. The boy was not crying and was not hurt, so everyone started playing again one by one. My grandpa and his gang were a little scared, but they were convinced that he got mad because that kid hit him on the nose. No one was paying any more attention to what just happened. The next day at school, the four of them had a lot of fun talking about the storyboard show. "If you go to the show today, someone will get a toy." "I wonder what he's gonna give us. I can't wait to go." Grandpa said he was a little bothered by what happened yesterday, but when he saw how excited Mio-chan was, he couldn't help but think that he was the one who introduced the picture story show to her. After school that day, it was cloudy unlike the day before. It looked like it was going to start raining at any moment. Everyone went home to get umbrellas, then they all met at the park. When Grandpa arrived there were only 3 of his friends, the Uncle Big Nose who was wearing a raincoat, and 2 other kids. After buying candy as usual, Grandpa said to his gang, "Everyone didn't come because they thought it was gonna rain." "No, it's because they were scared of the uncle yesterday." "Well, now we have a better chance of getting a toy." The 4 of them were having a good time. Well, let's get started. After a while, a picture story show by Uncle Big Nose started. As Grandpa expected, the show was something he's never seen and was a lot of fun. It was a different kind of fun from ordinary picture story shows he remembers. After a while, it started to rain a little bit, but Grandpa didn't care and was absorbed in the story. All right, that's all for today, Uncle Big Nose said, and started to get ready to leave. Well, that was fun. I think the hero at that scene was... The four of them were excitedly discussing their impressions of the show. And then... Yes! You four came yesterday as well. As promised, I will give a present to one of you. Uncle Big Nose noticed Grandpa and his friends. Yay! Who's it gonna be? Oh, who is it? Who is it? Who is it? Everyone was dying to know who was going to be the lucky kid that day. Today, my dear, I have a present for you, little girl. And the girl chosen was Mio. Yeah, I did it! Mio-chan was so happy with a big smile on her face. Grandpa and the gang were happy for her. Yeah! Congratulations! Mio-chan is amazing! They all congratulated her. Then Uncle Big Nose said, Well, let's go get your present with me. There's candy for everyone else too. So little girl, you pick one for everyone else. Every kid was ecstatic by then. Grandpa said, Yeah, Mio-chan, pick a good one for us. We're all counting on you. The kids said to Mio-chan. She was all smiles and proud of herself. I'll do that. Wait here for me until I get back, okay? She said, and walked with Uncle Big Nose to the mountain behind the park. She never came back. The three of them waited for her that day, but even after an hour, she had not returned at all. They looked for her in the back hills and around the neighborhood, but could not find her. It was almost 5 p.m., and they had to go back home because it was their curfew time. Takeshi said, I guess Mio-chan got a nice present, so she took it all for herself and went home, didn't she? We all decided to go home for that day. It was around 8 p.m. that night. Grandpa's mother got a call and was panicking. You know Mio-chan? She hasn't gone home yet. Grandpa was shocked and instantly went pale. Even as a child, he felt like he was involved in something terrible. He told his parents what had happened. His father immediately made a phone call and left the house. When Grandpa woke up the next morning, he was told to go to the police station with his mother. At the police station, they asked him a lot of questions about Uncle Big Nose. When was the first time he came? How many people knew him? How tall was he? How old was he? What were his facial features? Grandpa told them everything he could remember, and even though there were more than 50 children in the vicinity who knew Uncle Big Nose, neither him nor Mio-chan could be found. Then the elementary school temporarily banned the use of the park and made it mandatory for children to come and leave school in groups. After a while, the park was visited by volunteers and police on patrol. The other storyboard artists were also banned from the park. When he was about to graduate from elementary school, the friends he used to play with changed, and the incident was gradually forgotten. However, Grandpa says that even now, when he sees people with big noses, he recalls those days. My NPO is working to save dogs that are about to be disposed of and find foster homes for them. One day, a member of our team rescued a few dogs from a shelter. If they had been 1 day later, they would have been sent to the dream box. A dream box is simply a name for a gas chamber for animal disposal. The dogs are captured and placed in cages and are given a 7-day grace period before they are allowed to go back to their owners or get adopted. If a caretaker appears during that time, they are spared and are sent home, but if not, the cages move closer and closer every day to the dream box. When the time comes, the dogs are led into the gas chamber and locked in, where they are exposed to a high concentration of carbon dioxide for about 15 minutes. After the first minute or two for dogs and 45 seconds for cats, the dogs are overcome by intense sleepiness and lose consciousness. Even if they are left for 5 minutes, they'll die of oxygen deprivation. The body is then incinerated. Some say this method is the closest to euthanasia, but there are, of course, counter-arguments. The footprints the dogs leave on the gas chamber window from the inside are enough to make one's heart suffer. 4 of the dogs rescued from the brink of the dream box were adult Dobermans. One was a black mongrel puppy, probably only 6 months old. They looked as if they were cubs. When I asked the police why anyone would throw away such cute puppies, they told me it was them who had brought the dogs to the shelter. The man arrested in the murder case was a dog breeder, and the dogs were in police custody as evidence. Although it's rare, some dogs are disposed of in connection with such incidents. The Dobermans were in good health and are popular breeds, so they should be able to find their forever homes soon. Especially for puppies, or experience has shown us that they can find homes quickly. After a thorough physical and mental checkup, we give the dogs a good trim, and then we hold an adoption event to look for foster homes for them. We then hold a transfer event to find homes for the puppies. Sure enough, new homes were quickly found for the animals, and they all started their new lives. This is the end of our story as a normal shelter dog activity, but after this, the situation became bizarre. About 3 months later, one of the dogs that the rescue team had brought from the shelter was a dog that looked familiar to us. It was a black dog of a mongrel breed that we had previously saved. I asked a member of the team to confirm the dog's identity. "Isn't this the same dog you picked up at the house once before?" "Really? Actually, this dog, it seems that the police had asked us to dispose of it again." "The police? You don't think it's related to the case again? Did something happen to the foster parents?" We tried to contact the owner using their records, but our calls went unanswered. When we looked into the case, we found that the entire foster family had died in an accident caused by a carbon monoxide poisoning, and the only remaining dog had been taken into police custody. The police investigated the case as an incident, accident, and suicide, and eventually it was decided that it was an accident. This dog had survived 2 trips to the gas chamber by our hands. Or perhaps he survived 3 times, since his foster parents died in a gas accident and this dog was the only one who survived. It is a strange fate, but it was not the dog's fault. Again, we matched the dog with a foster home and sent him on his way. A few months passed by. We received a request directly from the police to take a dog into custody, and when the action team rushed to the scene, there was that black dog again. The foster parents who had taken the dog in were on their way to another prefecture to camp with the dog when they collided with a truck on a mountain pass. The reaction caused the dog to fall off a cliff, killing the entire family in a tragic accident. The police had taken the only surviving dog into custody, and in the course of their investigation, they found out that our NPO was the source of the dog's referral and contacted us. We patted him on the head and told him, "You're the first dog to come back here 3 times." The dog had no trouble at all and had a good appetite, but the members of the action team questioned me. "The house where this dog goes up ends up in an unfortunate death. I know he's just a dog, but don't you think this is a little weird?" It is true that the dog has had a string of bad luck, but it is too much to blame him. That's some occult stuff. This is where superstitious stories come from. I countered, "Think about it from the dog's point of view. Put yourself in the dog's shoes. The saddest thing of all is for the dogs to lose their owners." "I guess you're right. Sorry, I didn't mean it." After we performed physical and mental checks on the dog, we sent him to the adoption center for the 3rd time. The dog quickly found his new home and began his new life. A few months later, another incident occurred. A day later, one of the members of a team who had been on their way to the shelter submitted a resignation letter. When we asked him about it, he started crying, saying that he was no longer qualified to save dogs. As a matter of fact, on that day, I went to the disposal site as usual and checked the cage of the dream box. The black dog was there again. The staff told me that the police had left the dog there. When the members heard that the dog was going to be sent to the gas chamber tomorrow, they did not make an effort to find his new owner this time, but left him there to die. They had been working to protect as many dogs as possible, with the aim of eliminating the number of dogs being put to death, but the moment they saw the dog, they felt they had no choice but to let it die. He couldn't stand the conflict within himself and thought he was no longer fit for the job. "And then there's this. Look," he said, and opened a page of a special article in a magazine and showed it to me. It was a journal about a murder case committed by a breeder when the black puppy was first rescued. In the article, the owner said in an interview, "I got a puppy from overseas that was rumored to have the blood of the devil in him. There is no pedigree and it's difficult to identify the breed as it seems to have various blood, but I decided to keep it just in case." The puppy looked as it had glowing blue eyes in the moonlight in a photo of the article. As the golden eyes shone, the 4 Dobermans lined up obediently as if kneeling to a king. The interview of the man continued. "Eventually, a thought began to form in my mind that the pup wanted to eat human flesh. I can't quite remember how it happened, but once I did, the thought wouldn't go away at all. Soon enough, I started pulling in and cooking strangers for the pup to eat. So I'm honestly relieved that the police caught me when I killed the 3rd person. I'm finally free from that dog. I was just going nuts in my mind. I'm innocent, I tell you." This was the content of his memoir. A breeder who kills people and feeds them to his dogs. Can we take him seriously? Isn't he making a desperate excuse to avoid the death penalty by creating a state of mental exhaustion? I try to comfort the member's decision and suggested that he leave the active duty unit for a while. The next day, I received a call from the police. They wanted us to help them capture a wild dog that had escaped. When I listened to the story, there was something inexplicable. They said that the dog had escaped from a dream box at a dog pound. I had a bad feeling in my mind. I asked the officer, "Was it a black dog?" "Yeah, you're right. How did you guess?" "How did the dog escape from the dream box? That device is designed to prevent escaping, isn't it?" The officer replied, "The staff of the disposal facility pressed the button to inject the gas as usual, and 15 minutes later, after exhausting the gas chamber, they opened the door. Normally, there were only corpses lying around, and all that was left to do was to incinerate the bodies. Unfortunately, one of the staff members was jumped on by a dog at the scene and died from a hard blow to the head." "That's impossible. It's impossible not to die in that dream box." "That's why we're searching for him, even if it's just a dog. We could really use some professional help here." We held a small meeting to discuss the situation. If we cooperate with the police, we will certainly be taking part in the disposal of the dog. As a non-profit organization, we couldn't do that. But then, one of the members, who had handed in his resignation yesterday, raised his hand and said, "I guess I'm going to have to resign." He said, "I'll cooperate with the police. What do you think? This scenario is the only way I won't be in conflict with the philosophy of this NPO, will it?" We tried to comfort him, but he seemed to have made up his mind this time. All we could do was to let him go. We accepted his resignation and sent him to the police. I noticed right then and there I was cheering for him in my heart. Since then, I have not been able to contact him and have not yet received any reports of the black dog being captured.